When you see a woman standing all by herself where the roads split, you know something went terribly wrong to get her there. This isn't a tale about how she got left behind. That is just the start of things. This is about the moment she quit waiting for someone to return and started mending the broken pieces right in front of her. You see, the finest things in life do not always come from a perfect plan. They come from knowing what to do when things fall apart. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
Sarah let the ring drop into the dirt, not even caring where it fell. The silver band, always too thin and never the real gold he swore it was, flashed once in the high noon sun before it vanished in the ruts. Her hands were trembling. She willed them to be still. 3 roads stretched out before her. One went north into the mountains, another east across more flat prairie, and the last went south toward the town where his mother had called her plain. Her heavy satchel rested by her feet. Everything she called her own was inside. 2 dresses, her father's pocket watch, and a tin of his old buttons. For 2 hours she had sat there, her face burned by the sun and her lips cracked where she kept licking them. The watch ticked away in her palm. It was the same sound she remembered from his blacksmith shop, right before the fever took him. A wagon groaned as it came around the bend. It was a nice one, a buckboard pulled by a fine black horse, but it was leaning hard to one side. The wheel was carving a crooked line deep into the dust. If you have ever found yourself at a fork in the road with a hard choice to make, go ahead and leave a comment to let us know where you are tuning in from. The people who truly understand a story like this are the ones who have faced their own crossroads. Sarah started walking toward the wagon. Her boots were silent in the thick dust. The man jumped when she spoke. "Your kingpin is cracked. If you keep going, the axle is going to break." He just stared at her. Sweat stained the collar of his shirt and trickled down from his hair. A road is no place for a woman to be alone. She did not bother to answer him. She knelt down beside the wheel. The iron rim was hot enough to scorch her skirt. She slid her hand along the hub, pushing where the wood met the metal, and felt it give. "You got any tools?" He motioned toward a box behind the seat. She lifted the lid. Inside were brand new hammers and wrenches, still wrapped in greasy paper. It was a rich man's set of tools. They had probably never been touched. "These will do the job." He said nothing. She found what she needed, an iron tent stake and his leather belt. She hiked up the hem of her skirt. Her petticoat was already a lost cause from the walk, so she ripped off a strip of fabric. The sound of the tearing muslin was loud in the silence. "Hold this wheel with both your hands. Do not let it move an inch." He knelt down next to her. He was so close she could smell the scent of horse, sweat, and leather. His shadow covered her hands as she worked. She moved quickly. She wrapped the stake along the crack in the kingpin and then cinched his belt around it. The leather was high quality, worn soft right where it usually sat on his waist. She tied the whole thing together with the strip of cloth. "Pull." He pulled harder. "Where did you learn to do that? Just hold it steady." She pulled the knot tight. Her hands were now covered in black axle grease, the same grime that was always under her father's fingernails. She could almost smell his shop again, a mix of iron, coal smoke, and the sharp scent of hot metal. She got to her feet and wiped her palms on her skirt. The cream-colored fabric was beyond saving anyway. He tested the wheel, letting the wagon roll forward about 3 feet. The fix held firm. When he turned back to her, she was already walking away. "Wait." He took out a canteen and held it out to her. She took it without a word of thanks. The water was warm and had a tinny taste, but it was wet. She took 3 long gulps and handed it back. "My father had a shop." She was not sure why she told him that. "He fixed things." His gaze traveled from her face down to her dress. He saw the torn hem, the missing buttons on her collar, and the new grease stains. Then his eyes met hers again. He did not ask the question she could see him forming. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" He then asked where she was going. Sarah looked down the 3 roads. There was nothing but dust, prairie grass, and shimmering heat in every direction. She had been sitting at this very spot for 2 hours before he showed up. She had not made a decision. She could not make one. I do not know yet. The words sounded flat and empty, but they were true. He shifted his stance, and the buckboard groaned. His eyes went from her face to her satchel, then back to the 3 roads. Finally, he looked at her left hand and the bare ring finger. The skin there was paler, a faint white line where the silver band had been for 3 months. "You got any family?" "No." That was all she said. No more explanation. Her throat was still parched from the dust. She could feel the grit on her tongue. He stared out at the horizon, not looking at her. "I need a housekeeper. The last one quit on me. She said the ranch was too far out of town." He paused. "It is too far out of town." Sarah's hands were still black with grease. She rubbed her thumb across her palm. The grease would not come off without lye soap. "What does it pay?" He turned around. He seemed surprised that she had asked. $20 a month. She did the math in her head. That was what her father used to pay his apprentice. It was more than a woman could make sewing, but less than a cook earned at a hotel. "Do I get my own room?" "Yes." "I would be in charge of the house?" "Yes." "And if I decide to leave, I can just leave?" He finally looked directly at her. His eyes were gray, much lighter than she would have guessed. "I am not looking for a woman to hang curtains or teach me table manners. The last one tried that. It made us both miserable." Sarah's fingers touched the button on her collar. It was one of the 3 that were left, made of bone, not shell. Her mother had stitched it on good and tight. "I do not know how to do those things anyway." Something in his expression changed. It was not quite a smile, but the hard line of his mouth softened a little. "How far is it?" 3 hours. She glanced back down the road she had come from. The ring was still there. She could just make out a small, bright glint of sun on metal between the ruts in the road. She could see it all the way from here. It was silver plate, not solid silver. It was worth maybe $2 if she sold it in the next town. Maybe even less. Her father's watch kept ticking in her dress pocket. She could feel its steady presence against her hip. It was a constant, reliable rhythm. That and his leather apron were the only things he had left her, besides the knowledge of how iron bends when you put it to the fire. She grabbed her satchel, walked over to the buckboard, and pulled herself up. The leather seat was hot and cracked, but it was wide enough for 2 people. She sat down on the right side and put the bag between her feet. The brass buckles clinked together. He stood there for a second, just watching her sit in his wagon. He looked like he was trying to figure out if this was really happening. Then he gave a single nod and climbed up next to her. The seat sank under his weight. She felt the wagon shift. He picked up the reins, which were dark with sweat and worn smooth where he held them. He clicked his tongue. The horse leaned into its harness. The wagon lurched forward. The wheel held. Sarah did not look back at the crossroads. She did not look back at the ring. But she knew the exact moment they passed it. She could feel it, the very second the buckboard shadow passed over that tiny piece of silver lying in the dust. The vast prairie opened up before them. There was nothing but grass, sky, and heat. No trees, no buildings, not another soul on the road. It was just the 2 of them. The only sounds were the creaking of the wheel, the horse's hooves, and the jingle of the brass on the harness. The sun was past its peak and was starting its slow descent toward the western horizon. She figured it was about 2 o'clock. A 3-hour ride would get them to the ranch around 5, well before it got dark. That was a good thing. Her hands were still black. She looked down at them. There was grease under every nail and worked deep into the lines of her palms. Her father's hands had looked just like that every day of his life, right up until the fever took him. She had washed his hands after he passed, scrubbed them with lye soap and a stiff brush until her own hands were raw. But the grease never fully washed away, not even in death. The iron had left its mark on him. The man sitting beside her had not told her his name. She had not offered hers. They rode on in silence. The wagon swayed on the rough ground. The prairie grass moved in waves like a golden green ocean, some of it waist-high and heavy with seeds. After about an hour had passed, he spoke. "The name is Silas." She waited a moment, then answered, "Sarah." He just nodded. He did not ask for any more, and he did not offer any more. Another long stretch of quiet settled between them. The sun was getting lower now, casting long shadows from the blades of grass. Sarah's back ached from sitting so straight. She allowed herself to lean back just a little. The seat was not comfortable, but it was a whole lot better than standing at that crossroads. It was better than walking down any of those 3 roads with nothing but a satchel and 19 cents in her pocket. A knot formed in her stomach. She had just agreed to travel 3 hours into the middle of nowhere with a man whose last name she did not even know, to live in his house and work for him. Her mother would have said she was being a fool. Her father, well, he might have understood. The wheel creaked, the very same one she had just fixed with his belt and a piece of her own petticoat. She could see the repair from her seat. The leather strap was holding the stake in place, keeping the kingpin from breaking apart completely. It was a temporary fix, good for maybe 10 miles, 15 if he took it slow. Silas was taking it slow. The ranch came into view on the horizon just as the sun kissed the edge of the world. There was a white house, a red barn, and a corral with 3 men standing near it, all watching the buckboard get closer. The wagon rolled into the yard just as the sun disappeared. The house was 2 stories tall, with white paint peeling at the edges. It was built to be useful, not to be pretty. Behind it stood a large red barn, its paint solid and new, made of strong cedar. Corral with some mighty fine fencing. Down by the barn, 3 old-timers stopped their work and just stood there, watching. Silas pulled the gelding to a halt and set the brake. Those men didn't so much as twitch, just kept their eyes on the wagon. Sarah felt her own hands tighten around the handle of her carpetbag. Silas hopped down and started walking toward the men. Sarah stayed put in the buckboard wagon. Her legs felt stiff after sitting for 3 long hours. The worn leather seat had pressed creases right into her skirt. "New housekeeper," Silas called out, loud enough for her to hear plain. "Miss Sarah." He never said her last name. Heck, she hadn't known his was Kane until about an hour ago, when he'd pointed out the start of his land. The 3 men gave a slow nod. One of them tipped his hat, showing a full head of gray hair. All 3 of them were old, 50 at least, maybe closer to 60. They had faces weathered by the sun and backs bent from hard work, not at all the young ranch hands she had pictured. They gave her one quick look, then turned right back to their chores. Not a single question, not one word. Sarah carefully climbed down from the buckboard. Her boots made a soft thud in the dirt. Her knees felt like they might give out, but she locked them straight. Silas unhitched the horse and led it toward the barn. The 3 men fell in behind him. She could hear their low voices rumbling, but couldn't make out a thing they said. She just stood there in the yard, holding her bag. The house right in front of her, the barn at her back, and nothing but open prairie stretching out in every direction. There were no other buildings anywhere in sight, and no road to speak of except for the dusty track they had just bounced along. The front door of the house was standing wide open like an invitation. She walked toward it. She went up 3 wooden steps, her feet echoing across a porch with boards that groaned under her weight, and stepped through the doorway. Inside, it was dim after being in the bright Texas sun. She had to blink a few times, waiting for her eyes to adjust. A big oak table stood in the middle of the main room. 6 ladder-back chairs were pushed around it. Only 4 of them matched. The other 2 were made of a different, darker wood. A sideboard stood against one wall with a stack of dishes on top. There were no cabinets and no curtains hanging on the windows. The floors were clean, swept not long ago, but they were completely bare. A narrow, steep staircase led to the 2nd floor. "This way." She turned around. Silas had come in behind her, quiet as a shadow. She had not heard him at all. He walked past the table to a door on the right side of the room and opened it. Housekeeper's room. Sarah followed him to the doorway. The room was small, maybe 10 feet square, with one window that faced east. An iron bed frame was pushed against the far wall, and that was it. The floor was swept clean, just bare wood, no rug. "I will have the rest of the furniture brought in," he said it while looking at the empty floor, not at her. Sarah set down her carpet bag. The sound seemed to bounce off the empty walls. She walked over to the window and looked out. From there she could see the corrals, and beyond them, the endless prairie grass moving in waves with the wind. "Thank you." Silas just nodded. Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him. Sarah stood all alone in that empty room. It was the first time she had been by herself in hours, the first time since she'd left the crossroads. She could hear him moving around in the main room, the heavy sound of his boots on the wood floors, then the creak of the stairs as he went up. She sat down on the bed frame. The iron felt cold right through her dress. Her hands started to tremble. She just watched them shake, unable to make them stop at first. Then she pressed them down flat and hard against her thighs. The shaking finally slowed down and then stopped. She stood up and smoothed her skirt. The ugly grease stains were still there, black marks against the cream-colored fabric. Her hands were still dirty, too. She needed some water and soap. The room felt way too big with nothing in it. She knew her voice would echo if she tried to speak, so she stayed silent. She opened her carpet bag. Inside were 2 dresses, her father's old pocket watch, a small tin of buttons, and his leather apron, folded up small at the bottom. She lifted out the apron and carefully unfolded it. The leather was cracked and worn. It had little burn marks from flying sparks at the forge. It still smelled like smoke and coal and hot iron. She held it for a long moment, then folded it back, up again, and set it on the floor beside the bed frame. Her stomach felt empty and hollow. She had not eaten a thing since that morning. Just one piece of hardtack back at the crossroads. That felt like a lifetime ago. She left the little room, closing the door softly behind her. The main room was even darker now. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon. A deep orange light streamed through the windows, but it was fading fast. She found the kitchen through a doorway on the opposite side of the house. A big cast-iron stove stood against the wall. It was still warm when she touched it. A wood box sat beside it, filled with split logs. She opened the stove door and saw red coals glowing inside. She added some wood, a few small pieces at first, then some larger ones. The fire caught and orange flames started licking up. A sideboard held the supplies. There was salt pork in a crock, some canned tomatoes, a tin with a red cross on it, flour in a cloth sack, lard, coffee, salt. She found a pan. She cut 3 thick slices of the salt pork and set them in the pan on the stove. The meat started to sizzle right away. Grease pooled in the pan. The smell filled the whole kitchen. Her stomach gave a painful cramp. She decided to make biscuits using flour, lard, salt, and water from a pump by the sink. She mixed it all with her hands. The dough was sticky. She added a little more flour, kneaded it on the sideboard, and cut out circles with the rim of a tin cup. She set them on a flat pan and put the pan right in the oven. The salt pork was cooked through. She moved it onto a plate, then opened the can of tomatoes. She poured them into the hot pan with the grease and let them heat up. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Silas came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. "You did not have to cook." "I was hungry." He gave a slight nod. He sat down at the table. It was the same oak table from the main room, but it extended into the kitchen. She had not noticed that before. She pulled the biscuits from the oven. They were golden brown on top. She put them on a plate and brought everything to the table. She set it all down in front of him, then went back to fix her own plate. They sat at opposite ends of the long table. She ate. The salt pork was tough to chew. The biscuits were a bit dry. The tomatoes were almost too hot to eat. But she did not care one bit. Her stomach had finally stopped its cramping. Silas pulled a newspaper from his back pocket. The Gazette, 3 days old, according to the date on top. He unfolded it. He read while he ate. She watched him fold each page, careful and precise, with no crumpling at all. When he finished reading, he folded it back up exactly the way it had been. She stood up, gathered the dirty dishes, and carried them over to the sink. There was a tin basin there. She pumped some water. It was ice cold. It splashed loudly into the basin. She found a rag and started washing. The light was almost completely gone. There was just a thin line of orange on the western horizon, visible through the window. Silas stood up. She heard his chair scrape against the floor, then the sound of his footsteps. Then a warm light bloomed beside her. He had brought the coal oil lamp from the table and set it on the sideboard right next to the sink. It was close enough for her to see what she was doing. "Thank you." Those were his first words to her since he had promised to have furniture brought in. She just nodded and kept on washing. He left the kitchen. She heard him climb the stairs again. A door closed somewhere upstairs. She finished the dishes and dried them with a towel she found hanging on a nail. She stacked them back on the sideboard, wiped down the table, and checked the stove, banking the fire so it would be ready for the morning. The little flame in the lamp wavered from a draft coming through the window. She picked up the lamp and carried it back to her room. She set it on the floor next to her carpet bag. The room looked smaller in the lamplight, and the shadows seemed much deeper. She closed the door. There was no lock on it, only a simple latch. She set it. Then she sat down on the bed frame again. The iron was still cold. She pulled off her boots and set them beside the bed. Her feet ached something awful. Her stockings were damp with sweat. She peeled them off. Her feet looked pale against the dark wood floor. She lay down on the bare bed frame. There was no mattress, no blanket, just hard iron slats. They dug into her back right through the fabric of her dress. She shifted around, trying to find a position that did not hurt. She could not. The lamp flame flickered, making the shadows dance on the walls. She stared up at the ceiling, at the bare wooden beams. She could see the nails, the grain of the wood, and a spider web tucked in a corner. Her father's watch was ticking in her dress pocket. She pulled it out and opened the case. The hands showed it was 8:30. She wound it. 13 turns, the same as every single night. She closed the case and held the watch against her chest. The house creaked and groaned. It could have been the wind or the old house settling, or Silas moving around upstairs. She could not tell for sure. She closed her eyes, then opened them again. The ceiling was still there with the spider web and the wooden beams. She had left everything she knew behind. The town, his family, the church where they were supposed to be married, the little room she had rented for 3 months while she planned a wedding that never even happened. Now she was here, in an empty room on a ranch 3 hours from anywhere, with a man whose last name she had only learned 2 hours ago. She thought she should feel scared. She pressed her palm flat against the iron bed frame. It was cold, solid, and real. Tomorrow, furniture would arrive. He had said so. She was not sure if she believed him, but the stove had been warm when she found it. The floors had been swept clean. The firewood was split and stacked neatly. He had been expecting someone. The real question was whether or not he had been expecting her. The sound of wagon wheels woke her up. It was still dark outside. Sarah opened her eyes. The ceiling beams were just black shapes above her. She had maybe slept for 3 hours, maybe less. The hard iron bed frame had bruised her shoulders and her hips. Every single breath hurt. She pulled on her gray work dress. It was the only other one she owned. She buttoned it up in the dark. Her fingers found each button by feel. They were bone. 6 of them. All were there. She went over to the window. A covered wagon was sitting in the yard. It had a white canvas bonnet. 2 men were unloading something from the back. Silas stood beside them, pointing and giving directions. Sarah walked to the door and lifted the latch. The hinges let out a loud squeak. She crossed the main room. The floorboards were cold under her bare feet. She went out the front door, across the porch, and down the steps. The dirt in the yard was cold, too. It was damp from the night dew. It stuck to the bottoms of her feet. Silas turned around and looked at her, his eyes, and landed on her bare feet, her back still to him. She spoke low. "Did not mean to wake you." He gave no reply. He just watched as the men hoisted something heavy wrapped in canvas. They hauled it toward the house, and Silas went right in after them. Sarah lingered there in the yard. More things were brought out of the wagon. A mattress, a thick one. The cloth covering it was brand new, the color of cream. A simple washstand made of pine came next. After that, a small three-legged wardrobe, also pine. A rug rolled up tight in blue and cream. And then, the quilt. One of the fellas unfolded it to check it over. The design made her stop cold. Hundreds of little fabric rings, all interlocking in a wedding ring pattern. Dark blue and cream stitched by hand. Every single piece was cut just so. Every seam was straight as an arrow. She could not take her eyes off it. Silas came back outside and saw her staring. "Had that ordered 3 weeks back," he said. "Been meaning to hire somebody decent. 3 weeks. That was before his wagon wheel broke, before she was stuck at that lonely crossroads, before he had ever laid eyes on her. The timing was almost too close to believe, unless he sent the order the very day his last housekeeper left." She walked over to the quilt. The man held it up for her. She ran a hand across the cloth. It was good cotton, quality stuff. The stitches were tight with no threads coming loose. The rings linked together in a pattern that just kept repeating, circle after circle, with no end in sight. "That is fine work," she said. The man nodded, folded it up real careful, and carried it on inside. The 2 men made 4 more trips, bringing every last thing into her room. She just stood on the porch and watched them go about their work. Silas stood in the doorway, telling them where to place each piece. His shoulders were all bunched up, like he was expecting her to say it was all wrong, that she wanted something else entirely. It took them maybe 20 minutes all told. When they finished, Silas walked them to the wagon, pulled out a leather pouch, and counted coins into each of their hands. They gave him a nod, climbed up onto the wagon seat, and turned the horses around. The wagon rumbled on out of the yard. The sky was getting lighter now. It was not sunrise just yet, but it was getting close. That gray hour right before the sun peeks over the land. Silas walked back toward the house. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked right up at her. His face was hard to make out in that dim light. "You need anything else?" "No?" He nodded once and headed for the barn. She watched him walk away, his back straight as a board. He had a long stride. The 3 old ranch hands were already awake. She could see them moving around inside the barn. She could hear the sound of hay being pitched and the soft whinnying of the horses. She went back inside her room and closed the door behind her. The new furniture filled up the space, making it feel smaller, cozier. The bed frame was set against the wall where the old one had been. The mattress sat on top, so thick her hand sank right into it when she pressed down. The washstand was placed under the window with a white porcelain bowl and pitcher sitting on it, each with a blue stripe around the edge. The wardrobe stood against the opposite wall, its doors shut. The rug was still rolled up beside it. The quilt was folded neatly on the bed. Sarah unrolled the rug. She laid it out next to the bed. It was made of braided strips of blue and cream fabric, tight and handmade. Somebody had spent a good long while cutting up that cloth, braiding it, coiling it, and stitching all those coils together. The colors were a perfect match for the quilt. She lifted the mattress. It was filled with corn husks. She could feel the separate husks shifting under her fingers and smell that dry, grassy scent. It made a crackling sound when she set it back down. She spread the quilt over the mattress, smoothing it out flat. The wedding ring pattern covered the entire bed, hundreds and hundreds of rings. She counted 12 rings across and 15 rings down, 180 rings in all. Each of those rings was made of maybe 20 little pieces of fabric. That came out to 3,600 pieces. Somebody had cut 3,600 tiny pieces of cloth and stitched every one of them together by hand. She sat down on the bed. The mattress gave way under her, soft and yielding. The old iron frame was not going to be digging into her back anymore. She pressed her palm flat against the quilt. The fabric felt cool and smooth. She stood up, opened her old carpet bag, and pulled out her 2 dresses, shaking them out. A little cloud of dust fell to the floor. She opened the wardrobe. Inside, there were wooden pegs for hanging clothes. A shelf ran across the top. She hung up both dresses. They looked mighty small and lost in that big empty wardrobe. She took out her father's pocket watch and set it on the washstand next to the pitcher. The brass casing caught the gray light of dawn coming through the window. The little tin of buttons was next. She opened it up. There were bone buttons, and buttons, metal ones, and some covered in fabric. Her father had kept them in a drawer at his shop, for when a customer needed a button replaced. She had taken the whole tin after he passed. She set it right beside the watch. The last thing was his apron. She unfolded it. The leather was stiff and cracked in places, dotted with burn marks from flying sparks. One of the straps was broken. She had always meant to fix it. She just never did. She looked around the room and spotted a nail sticking out of the wall next to the wardrobe, probably left over from an old picture or a shelf. She hung the apron on it. The leather hung there all crooked on account of the broken strap, but it was the first thing she had put up herself. She stepped back and took in the room. The bed with its beautiful quilt, the washstand with her father's watch and button tin, the wardrobe holding her dresses, the rug on the floor, and the apron on the wall. It looked like a place where someone actually lived. She sat on the bed again, resting her hands in her lap. Her palms were still black with grease from the day before. She knew she ought to wash them. Lye soap would get most of it, but not all of it. It never got all of it. A lump formed in her throat that she could not seem to swallow down. Her eyes started to burn. She pressed the heels of her hands against them, pushing hard until she saw stars. She dropped her hands. The room was still there, just as real as before. She heard footsteps in the hall. Then a soft knock on her door. She stood, smoothed down her dress, and wiped her face with her sleeve, even though no tears had fallen. Yes. The door opened. Silas was standing in the doorway. He did not come in, he just looked. His eyes traveled around the room, taking in the furniture, the apron on the wall. Then his gaze came back to her face. "If it is not to your liking, we can—" She cut him off. She did not let him finish. She could not let him finish. If he said one more kind word, if he offered to change a single thing, she felt like something inside her chest would crack clean open, and she would never get it closed again. "It is better than fine." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. His face seemed softer than it was yesterday. The hard lines around his mouth seemed less deep. Then he just nodded and pulled the door shut. She listened to his footsteps fade down the hall. She heard the front door open and close. She sat back down on the bed. The quilt was so smooth under her hands. Wedding rings, hundreds of them, and not a single one was hers. But all of them meant something different to her now. The porcelain pitcher on the washstand was full of water. She had not even noticed. Someone must have filled it this morning before dawn while she was still sleeping on that bare iron frame. She poured some water into the bowl. It was cold and clear. She dipped her hands in. The water turned gray, then went black. She scrubbed her palms together, getting under her nails and between her fingers. The water got darker and darker. The grease began to lift, but not all of it. Some of it stayed, ground deep into the lines of her palms and in the cracks around her nails. She dried her hands on her skirt and looked at them. They were still stained, but they were cleaner. The window faced east. The sun was coming up for real now, sending streaks of orange light across the prairie. She could see for miles and miles. Grass bent in the wind like waves on an ocean. There were no trees, no buildings, no roads to speak of except the one that led right here. There was nothing at all between her and the horizon. She turned back to the room. The quilt caught the morning light. The blue fabric looked almost purple. The cream-colored parts looked like gold. The wedding rings seemed to glow. Her back ached from sleeping on those iron slats. Her shoulders were bruised. Her hips complained when she moved. She was tired, tired down to her bones, the kind of tired that one night of sleep cannot fix. But she had a mattress now, a real mattress, and a quilt, and a room that looked like someone cared if she stayed or if she left. She lay down on the bed, on her side, and drew her knees up. The mattress was soft and the quilt felt smooth against her cheek. She could smell the new cloth, the dried corn husks, and the pine from the furniture. Her father's watch ticked on the washstand, a steady, reliable sound, the same sound it had made in his shop every single day for 20 years. She closed her eyes. Sleep came over her fast and deep with no dreams at all. When she woke up, the sun was high in the sky. It had to be mid-morning at least, maybe even later. She could hear voices outside, men talking back and forth, the sound of hammering like something was being built or repaired. She sat up. Her body still hurt, but not as bad. The sleep had surely helped. She stood and looked around the room one more time. In the full light of day, it looked different. It looked real and solid, like it had been sitting here waiting for her this whole time. She walked to the door and opened it. The house was quiet. Silas must have been outside with the men. She could hear them clearer now. They were talking about the north fence, something about wire needing to be replaced. She went into the kitchen and found some bread and butter. She ate standing right there at the sideboard. The bread was from yesterday, a little hard around the edges, but she did not mind one bit. After she ate, she stepped outside. Silas was over by the barn with the 3 ranch hands. They were loading tools into a wagon, hammers and wire cutters and big rolls of barbed wire. He saw her and gave her a nod. She nodded back. The day stretched out before her, long and full of purpose. There was work to be done, a house to get in order, meals to cook, and a new life to start building. She went back inside and began making a list in her head of what needed doing, what needed organizing, and where everything ought to go, ought to just leave. But before she did, something had to be settled in her mind. She had to know if that furniture, and that quilt especially, was truly ordered 3 weeks ago like he said, or if he was telling a tall tale and sent for it yesterday, right after bringing her to this place. Because if he lied, well, that meant something entirely different. It meant he made up his mind about her long before she ever made up hers about him. And she couldn't rightly say if that was a good thing or a bad thing. 4 weeks slipped by. Sarah was now the first one up. Every morning she would come downstairs in the pitch dark. She would build up the fire in the stove while a chill was still in the house and set the coffee pot on to boil. Its rich aroma filled the kitchen just as his footsteps would creak on the staircase. He would come on in, pour a cup for himself, and stand near the stove to warm his hands. She would crack eggs into the skillet. He would slice the bread. Neither of them said a word until the sun had cleared the horizon. When the stove burned low, he would say, "I will get some wood." He would go out and return with an armful of split logs. He would stack them neatly in the box. She would then adjust the damper, and the fire would roar back to life. They ate their breakfast at the table. He read the local paper. She just watched the light change as it streamed through the window. When they were done, she washed the dishes. He dried them. He put them back on the sideboard, right back where they belonged. After that, he would head to the barn. She would sweep the floors, look after the chickens, and work in the little kitchen garden she had planted out behind the house. She had picked up some basil seedlings from the mercantile on their first trip to town. She transplanted them, then added some thyme and sage. The little seedlings were starting to take hold. 3 inches of green were now pushing their way up through the dark, rich soil. In the afternoon, she would mend clothes, his shirts and the ranch hand's trousers, sitting on the porch with her sewing basket. He would ride by every now and then, checking on the fence lines or the water troughs. He would give a nod when he saw her. She would just nod right back. In the evenings, they would sit on that same porch after the dishes were done. He would smoke his pipe. She would continue her mending. The crickets always seemed to get louder as the sun dipped down. Sometimes he might talk about cattle prices or mention that the north pasture was about due for a burn. She would listen and then mention that the henhouse door was hanging a bit crooked. The very next day it would be fixed. No long discussion about it. It was just done. By the third week, she knew which floorboards creaked the loudest, which burner on the old stove got the hottest, and just how he liked his coffee, black, with 2 cups in the morning and 1 more after supper. She had started buying Arbuckle's brand coffee at the Mercantile. He noticed, but he never said a word about it. He just drank it. He knew that she kept her father's watch on the wash stand. He knew she wore her gray dress on Mondays and the cream-colored one on Fridays. Except the cream one was ruined now, so it was just the gray one every single day. He had ordered some fabric from town. He left it folded on her bed. It was a brown calico with enough material for 2 new dresses. She had already cut and sewn one of them. It was hanging in the wardrobe right now. She figured she would wear it next week. Their life settled into an easy, efficient rhythm, like 2 blacksmiths working together at the same forge. One heats the iron, the other hammers it, with no motion wasted between them. On a Tuesday morning in the 5th week, she was cleaning his office. It was a small room just off the main hall with a desk, a chair, a window that faced west, and shelves stacked 3 deep with ledgers. She was dusting. The dust rag caught on the corner of a ledger, pulling it right off the shelf. It fell to the floor and landed open. It was just pages and pages of numbers, all in columns. She glanced at them as she bent to pick it up. Something about the numbers looked wrong. She looked a little closer. She added up the first column in her head. The total written at the bottom did not match. She checked the next column over. It had the same problem. She checked a third one. It was wrong, too. She carried that ledger into the kitchen. She set it on the table, then went back and got 2 more. She spread them all out and started checking every line. That night, after the supper dishes were cleared, she stayed right there at the table. Silas came in from the porch and saw her with the ledgers spread open, a pen in her hand, an ink bottle at her elbow, a steel nib pen, the very same kind her father used to use. She had found it in a desk drawer. "Your books are all wrong." He stopped and set his pipe down on the sideboard. "How wrong are they? Your last bookkeeper could not add." She turned one of the ledgers around and pointed to a column. "This one says 412. It should be 398. She pointed to another one. "This one says 206. It should be 183. He pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning over the table to get a better look. His shoulder was nearly touching hers. She could smell the pipe tobacco, the leather from his saddle, and the dust from his ride. "Can you fix it?" "Yes." She worked for 3 nights straight. He would bring her coffee without her having to ask. He would set it down right beside her elbow, watch her work for a minute or so, and then he would leave. She would hear him go up the stairs and his door quietly close. She would keep on working with the lamp burning low and the pen scratching across the page. The India ink stained her fingers black. She reorganized everything. She made new columns for income and expenses. She separated cattle sales from feed costs and wages from supplies. She put all the dates in proper order, with subtotals for every month and grand totals at the very end. The numbers started to tell stories. Back in March, he had paid $240 for hay. In April, it was $260. In May, it was $280. It was the same supplier for the same amount of hay, but the price kept climbing. 10% each month, $20 here, $20 there. It was small enough that you might not notice, but it was big enough to matter over the course of a year. She showed it to him. "This here is wrong." He studied the pages for a long time. His finger traced the columns, following along with her work. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes." He rode into town the next day. He came back around dusk and walked straight into the kitchen where she was frying up some pork chops. The grease popped and sizzled in the hot pan. "You were right. The supplier was overcharging us. He said it was all a mistake. He gave me a credit." "How much?" $100. She flipped the pork chops over in the pan. A little fat spattered onto the stove. She wiped it clean with a rag. Good. The next morning, a brand new ledger was sitting on the table. It was bound in leather. with marbled end papers of green and cream. She opened it up. On the very first page there was writing in black ink. It was his handwriting, neat and slanted to the right. It said, Sarah Accounts, 1882. She ran her finger over the letters. The ink was already dry. He must have written it last night. After she had gone to bed, after he knew she had saved him money, after he knew she could be trusted with more than just cooking and cleaning. She sat down, opened it to the first blank page, dipped the pen in the ink and started a new entry. Date, income, expense. Her handwriting was right there on the page next to his. It was smaller, tighter, but it was there, and it was permanent. The evenings started to feel longer. After the dishes were put away, they would sit out on the porch. He would smoke. She would mend. But the silence between them felt different now. It was not uncomfortable, just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled up with talk. One night, he was the first to speak. You ever wonder why I do not live in town? She bit off a piece of thread and started another stitch, mending a tear in his shirt sleeve. No. Most men with money do. They have big houses, neighbors, and church socials every Sunday. You do not want those things. No. He drew on his pipe, and the tobacco inside glowed like a red ember. It is too much of a performance. She looked over at him. He was just staring out at the wide-open prairie. The moon was high and full, a bright white circle that lit up the grass and turned it silver. You mean lying? I mean pretending you are something other than what you are. He tapped the ash from his pipe. Wearing the right kind of clothes, saying all the right things, going to all the right places. All of it is false, all of it is just for show. She nodded and went back to her mending. Her father used to say something like that about iron. He said it did not pretend. It just was. It was either hot or cold, bent or straight, rusted or clean. There was no performance to it, no lies. My father used to say, iron does not perform, it just is. Silas looked at her. The smoke from his pipe curled in the air between them. It drifted away on the night breeze. That is right. They just sat there. The crickets seemed to get louder. A coyote called out from somewhere to the north. Another one answered from far away. The sound carried clear across the lonely wild prairie. She finished her mending, folded the shirt, and set it back in the basket. I should get some sleep. He nodded. She stood up and went inside to her room. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt felt smooth underneath her hands. It had a wedding ring pattern with hundreds of them stitched together. She pressed her palm flat against it. She could feel the tiny stitches, the careful work. Someone's time and someone's care had been put into the fabric, put into the pattern, and made to last. The old house creaked. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, then his door closing. She lay down and pulled the quilt up over her. The room was dark except for the moonlight that shone through the window. She could just make out the shape of her father's apron on the wall. It was hanging crooked because of the broken strap, but it was there, hanging, marking this place as her own. She closed her eyes. Her father's watch ticked away on the washstand, steady and reliable, the same rhythm it always had. She thought about the ledger with her name written in it. The ink was dry by now, permanent. She was not just the housekeeper, not just an employee. She was something more, something she did not have a name for just yet, but it was something real. Sleep came slowly, but it finally came. Morning arrived. She woke up before the dawn, just like always. She built the fire and started the coffee. He came down. They worked alongside each other in the kitchen. It was the same routine, the same rhythm, but it felt different now. Something had shifted like gears that had been loose but were now meshing perfectly. Everything was running smoother. Everything was fitting together better. It was Friday, the end of their 5th week. She was out working in her garden behind the house. The basil was 6 inches tall now, a full, vibrant green. She was pulling weeds from between the rows. The black soil was caked under her fingernails. Her hands smelled like crushed sage. She heard the sound of wagon wheels and looked up. A buggy was coming down the road. It was a fine-looking buggy with black lacquer paint, yellow wheels, and a red fringe on its canopy. It was much too fine for a Friday and way too fine for this part of ranch country. She stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. The buggy was getting closer. A woman was driving it all by herself. She was dressed way too fancy for this time of morning, in a burgundy dress with a black hat that had feathers on the side. A tightness grew in Sarah's chest. She recognized that buggy. She had seen it. In town, parked outside the hotel or the mercantile, was always spotless and gleaming. That buggy pulled into the yard. The woman saw Sarah and smiled, but that smile never made it past her lips. Mrs. Adelaide Frost had come for a visit. As the buggy stopped, Mrs. Frost climbed down, tied her horse to the porch rail, and smoothed out her skirts. The burgundy fabric seemed to catch the sun, and there was not a speck of dust on it from the road. Sarah started walking toward the house. Her apron was stained with dirt. Her dress was the plain brown calico Silas had bought her, practical and simple. Her feet were bare, since she had left her boots by the garden. Mrs. Frost turned and watched her approach. That smile of hers got a little wider, but it still did not reach her eyes. "You must be the new help," she said, not quite making it a question. "Help?" Sarah paused at the bottom of the porch steps, her toes dark with soil from the garden. "Yes, ma'am. I am Adelaide Frost, an old friend of Silas's." She looked Sarah up and down, taking in the dirty apron, the plain dress, the bare feet, and the fingernails caked with dirt. How rustic. The word just hung there in the air. Rustic, as if Sarah was just another part of the scenery. Like something wild and untamed, not quite a person. A hot blush rose on Sarah's face. She looked down at her feet. The dirt was ground into her skin, under her nails, and between her toes. She looked like a common field hand. Even worse, she looked like someone who had never owned a pair of shoes, someone who did not know any better. Mrs. Frost walked up the steps and onto the porch. Sarah's porch. But it was not really. It was Silas's porch, Silas's house, Silas's ranch. She was just the person who worked here. "Is he home?" Sarah's throat felt tight. "No, ma'am. He is out checking fence lines." "Oh." Mrs. Frost settled into one of the porch chairs, the one Sarah always used for mending, and arranged her perfect, clean skirts around her. "Well, I will wait then. You do not mind, do you?" It was not her porch to mind about. "I will make some tea." She went inside, her feet leaving dirty prints on the floor she had just swept that morning. Now it was dirty again, because of her, because she had been working in the garden like some hired help, like common labor. In the kitchen, she pumped water into the kettle. Her hands were shaking. The pump handle was cold, and water splashed onto the sideboard. She tried to wipe it with her apron, but that only left a smear of dirt. She got out the good china, the set from the high shelf with the white porcelain and blue flowers. She had washed it when she first arrived and put it away, never to be used. Now her dirty hands were touching it, leaving smudges. She tried wiping the cups with her apron, which only made it worse, smearing the dirt across the white porcelain. She set the cups on a tray with the teapot, the sugar bowl, and the cream pitcher. Her hands would not stop shaking, and the china rattled. The kettle whistled. She made the tea, let it steep for a moment, and carried everything out to the porch. The tray was heavy, and her arms trembled, making the cups rattle even louder. Mrs. Frost watched her set it all down. "How lovely," she said. "Real china. I was not sure Silas even owned any." Sarah started to pour, her hand shaking so much that tea slopped over the rim of Mrs. Frost's cup and into the saucer. Mrs. Frost's eyebrows shot up. She did not say a word, she just watched Sarah pour her own cup, which also spilled into the saucer. Sarah's face burned hotter than before. She sat in the other chair, Silas's chair. It felt all wrong, too big, like she was a little girl in a grown-up seat. Mrs. Frost took a sip, made a tiny face, and set her cup down. "How long have you been here?" "5 weeks. My, that is quite a while." Mrs. Frost's eyes roamed over Sarah again, taking in the dirty apron, the plain dress, and her bare feet with black caked toes. You must find it lonely. Just the two of you way out here. No other women, no proper company to speak of. Sarah's hands tightened on her cup. The porcelain was so thin she could feel it give under her fingers. I am not lonely. Of course not, Mrs. Frost said with that same cold smile. Still, people talk. You understand that, do you not? A single woman and a single man living together in the same house, with no chaperone, no family. It is such an unconventional arrangement. That word hit her like a slap in the face. Unconventional. It was just another way of saying wrong or improper or shameful. I am the housekeeper. Oh yes, of course, that is what everyone says. Mrs. Frost picked up her cup and took another small sip. But you know how these small towns are. People see what they want to see. They make up their minds about things. And when a woman lives alone with a man, her voice trailed off, letting the meaning hang in the air between them. Sarah's stomach twisted into a knot. She knew exactly what Mrs. Frost was saying, what people in town were probably saying, that she was his woman, that she had traded herself for a roof over her head and food on her table, that she was no better than a woman of the night, just with a nicer title. I work for him. I am sure you do, Mrs. Frost said, setting her cup down for good. It is just such a delicate situation for the both of you. I felt it was my duty as a friend to come and see for myself to make sure everything was appropriate. Appropriate. Sarah almost wanted to laugh. There was nothing appropriate about her. She was a woman all alone, left at a crossroads with nothing. No family, no one to speak for her, no past she could claim without feeling shame. She had climbed into a stranger's wagon and come to his ranch and moved right into his house. And now she wore dresses he bought, ate food he provided, and slept under a quilt he had ordered for her. She did not own a thing. She was nothing. Just help. Just someone he had hired because his last housekeeper had up and quit. Mrs. Frost stood up, smoothing her skirts again. Well, I should be going. But do think about what I said, Silas, about the social next month. It would be good for you to come into town more often, show folks that everything out here is proper. Hoofbeats sounded. Silas rode into the yard, saw the buggy, and his jaw tightened. He swung down from his horse, tied the reins, and walked toward the porch. Adelaide. His voice was flat and cold. Sarah had never heard him sound like that. Mrs. Frost offered a tight smile. Silas, there you are. I was just enjoying a cup of tea with your housekeeper. The little pause she took before that last word was sharp as a needle. Such a lovely girl. That is mighty kind of you. Well, I best be going, but you simply must come to the social. Everyone would be so pleased to see you. She shifted her gaze to Sarah. Her smile turned brittle. And you, my dear, if you ever find you need anything, a woman to confide in, some advice about your circumstances, you just come find me in town. Sarah gave a small nod. She couldn't find her voice. Her throat felt tight as a drum. Mrs. Frost went down the steps, untied her horse, and settled into the buggy. She turned it around. The yellow wheels shined in the sun. The red fringe danced. Then she drove off. The buggy vanished down the lane, and the dust began to settle. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Silas moved. Then he took the chair Mrs. Frost had been sitting in, lifted her teacup, and put it back down. The tea inside was still half there, cold by now. He looked straight at Sarah. Did she get to you? Sarah just stared at her own teacup. A tiny crack ran through it, a thin line from the rim all the way to the handle. She could not recall ever dropping it, but there it was, broken just like everything else seemed to be. She stood up, gathered the tray. The cups chattered against each other and tea splashed over their sides. She took it into the house, placed it on the kitchen table, and just stood there, her hands pressed flat against the wood. The dirt packed beneath her fingernails was so black, so deep. She had scrubbed them raw before making the tea. It had done no good. The grime was worked in too far. It felt permanent. Silas followed her inside and stood in the doorway. What did she say to you? Sarah just shook her head. She could not bring herself to look at him. If she looked at him, she was afraid she would only see what Mrs. Frost saw. A woman without a name, without a past, with no right to anything. Just living in his house, eating food he provided, wearing clothes he bought, and playing make-believe that she was something more. It does not matter. It does, especially if it is bothering you. I am fine, but she was not fine at all. She was standing in a kitchen that was not hers, inside a house that was not hers, on a ranch that was not hers. For 5 weeks she had been pretending this place was her home, that she had a place here, that she was helping build something real. But Mrs. Frost had seen the truth. She was just the hired help, just a woman Silas had taken on. And if he ever grew tired of her, if he found somebody better, someone more suitable, she would find herself right back at that lonely crossroads, or maybe somewhere even worse. She walked right past him and out the back door toward the garden, knelt down between the rows of basil, and started yanking weeds hard and fast. The roots tore loose, sending dirt flying. Her hands had started trembling again. She dug into the earth even harder, trying to force them to be still. She heard him come out of the house and sit down on the back step. The old wood groaned under his weight. He did not say a word. He just sat there. She kept right on working. She pulled 3 more weeds, then 4, then 5. Her fingernails snagged on the tough roots. One nail ripped down to the quick, and a bead of blood welled up, thin and red. She wiped it on her apron and kept right on pulling. She reminded me. Her voice came out scratchy. She cleared her throat but did not look his way, just kept her hands busy in the dirt. Of everything I do not have. She sat back on her heels then. Her hands were filthy, caked with dirt and streaks of blood and scrapes on her skin. She looked down at them. These were the hands of a person who toiled, a common person, the kind of person Mrs. Frost could look down her nose at and pity. I do not own a single thing here. She finally raised her eyes to his. He was just watching her. He held his pipe in his hand, but it was not lit. His face was impossible to read. The furniture, the quilt on the bed, the dresses, they are all yours. The food I put on the table, it is yours. The house I keep clean, it is yours. She looked back down at her own hands. I am just working here until the day you do not need me to anymore. There was only silence. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass. A crow cawed from the peak of the barn roof. Then the step creaked again. She heard his boots on the dirt, and he sat down beside the basil row, but not too close. There were about 3 feet of space between them. He turned the pipe over and over in his hands. You want to own something here? She did not reply. She had no idea how to reply to a question like that. Wanting was a dangerous thing. Wanting led to hoping, and hoping always meant you had something you could lose. He waited, the pipe still turning in his big hands, the sun beating down hot on both of them, the dark soil lying rich between the green basil plants. At last she spoke, her voice so small it was barely more than a whisper. I do not know if I am allowed to want a thing like that. Sarah did not answer him right away. She just kept on pulling weeds. Her torn fingernail was starting to throb. The bleeding had stopped, but the nail was all jagged. She would have to trim it down later, cut it straight across. It would probably grow back crooked. She sat back, wiping her hands on her apron again, leaving behind a mix of reddish-brown streaks, dirt and blood all mixed together. I built my life on promises one time before. Her voice came out stronger than she thought it would. She kept her eyes on the basil plants, not on him. It was easier that way. A man told me he would marry me. He said he would look after me after my father passed away. He said I would never have to worry about a thing. She pulled another weed, a small one this time. The root slipped out of the ground easy. His mother called me common. She said I was not good enough for him. And he did not say a word to defend me. The wedding day came. He never did. She dropped the weed and wiped her hands again, making the streaks even darker. So I do not know how to want things anymore. I do not know how to build on promises. They break far too easily. The wind whispered through the new grass, steady and constant. It was the same wind that had blown for weeks, for months, for years before she ever got here. And it would keep blowing long after she was gone. This time I thought I would just work. Earn my place. Prove I was worth keeping. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt, the blood, and the broken nail. But you gave me furniture before I had proven a thing. The quilt, the fabric for dresses, all of it, before I had done nearly enough to deserve it. She finally looked up at him. He was just watching her, his face serious, listening to every word and not interrupting. That scared me more than Adelaide ever could. He waited, not rushing her. Because it meant you were building something. And I have learned that when you build something, it can fall apart. And the higher you build it, the harder it falls. There was a long silence. A crow called out again, farther off this time. She could hear the ranch hands in the barn, the sound of hay being moved and a horse snorting. Silas shifted his weight, set down his pipe, and picked up a handful of dirt, letting it run through his fingers. It was dark and fine, good soil, the kind of soil where things grow. I was married before. Sarah's hand froze. She did not look at him. She just stared at the bright green veined basil leaves. They were perfect. A fever took her. 3 years ago, back in January. He picked up more dirt and let it fall. She watched his hands. They were scarred, just like hers, but with different scars from the same kind of work. She was from town. A good family. They all thought I would settle down there, open a business, buy a house on Main Street, and join the church board. He brushed the dirt from his hands. I thought she would settle down here. He found a stick and drew a line in the dirt between them, a straight, deliberate line. She hated it here, the isolation, the quiet, the endless work. She wanted neighbors, she wanted church socials every single week. She wanted to wear nice dresses and go to town events. He drew another line parallel to the first one. We tried for 2 years and both of us were miserable, both of us pretending it was going to get better. He dropped the stick and looked at the 2 lines in the dirt. They did not touch and they never would. She got sick that January. The doctor came out from town, but it took him 3 days to get all the way out here. By the time he arrived, the fever was just too high. He stared down at the lines he had drawn. She died angry with me for bringing her to a place she never belonged, for making her live a life she never in her heart wanted. He looked up at Sarah then, his gaze direct. There was no looking away. I made a promise to myself I would not do that to someone ever again, that I would not ask a person to try and squeeze into my life, that I would not bring someone out here who would just end up hating me for it. He picked his pipe back up, turning it in his hands. The clay bowl was smooth and worn from use. Then you came along and fixed my wagon wheel without ever asking if I wanted your help. You did not wait for me to beg. You did not ask for my permission. You just saw what needed doing, and you did it. He tapped the pipe against the palm of his hand. Nothing came out of it. It was already empty. I was not looking for another wife who would grow to resent me. I was looking for a partner who would stay because she wanted to be here, not because she felt she had to, not because of some promise she made, but because this was the right place for her to be. The words hung in the air between them. They felt heavy, and they felt true. There was no taking them back now. Sarah pulled another weed. This one had a deep root. She had to dig around it with her fingers to work it loose. Her torn nail caught on the root. She bit down on her lip, but she kept on working. The weed finally came free with a big clump of dirt still clinging to it. I am not her. I know that. I do not need church socials. I know that too. She set the weed down and brushed the dirt from her hands. It did not all come off. It never really did. But if I stay, if I truly stay, I need to know that it is mine as well. She looked at him. His face was weathered by the sun. There were lines around his eyes from squinting into the bright light. There was gray in his hair at the temples and a scar on his jaw from something. He had never told her what. He was not a young man. But then, neither was she. They had both learned their lessons the hard way. They had both been broken in their own ways, and they had both learned how to get back on their feet. The ranch, the decisions we make, the work. Not just the work in the house, not just the cooking and the cleaning and the mending, all of it. What exactly are you asking me? A partnership. The word came out clear and strong. It sounded real, a real partnership, not a job, not a charity case. A partnership. He looked at her for a long, careful moment like he was checking his measurements, making sure everything lined up just right before he committed to the cut. Then he held out his hand to her. She looked down at it. There was dirt under his nails, the same as under hers. There were scars from barbed wire running across his knuckles. His knuckles were calloused from a lifetime of hard work. These were the hands of a man who built things, who fixed what was broken, and who made things that were meant to last. Sarah reached out and took his hand. Their handshake wasn't soft or gentle, but hard and firm. It was the way men shook hands at the stockyards when a bargain was struck, when money was on the line and a deal was made that truly mattered. His grip was powerful and steady, the rough calluses pressing into her palm. Her own hand seemed small inside his, yet her grip was just as strong, meeting his pressure for pressure. This was a handshake between equals. They were partners. They held on for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5 before letting go. A warm tingle remained in Sarah's palm where his hand had been. She rubbed it on her thigh, smearing the dirt. She got to her feet, trying to brush the soil from her knees. It clung to her dress, her apron, and her hands. She felt like she was made of the very earth itself, the same stuff that things grow from. I ought to finish this weeding, she thought. He stood up too, picking up his pipe and dusting off his trousers. I should probably go check on the south pasture. I heard coyotes out there last night. They stood there a yard apart, with the basil patch between them and the vast prairie stretching out in every direction. The ranch spread before them, looking like something built to endure, something worth building upon. He gave a single nod, then turned and walked toward the barn. Sarah watched him go, noticing his straight back and long stride. It was the very same walk she had seen that first day at the crossroads when his wagon had limped toward her with a broken wheel dragging in the dust. She knelt back down, grabbed another weed, and gave it a pull. The root slid out clean. She tossed it aside and moved to the next one. Her hands had stopped trembling now. That night she lay in her bed and stared up at the ceiling. The moonlight streamed in, making the wooden beams look as if they were coated in silver. She could hear him moving about upstairs, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of water being poured, and finally the soft click of his door closing. The house settled into its nightly chorus of the wind, the crickets, and the occasional pop from the stove as it cooled. She thought about his hand in hers, how solid and real it felt. It was like iron that had been worked right, hammered and tempered and tested. It was the kind of hand that sealed a partnership, not a marriage and not a job. This was something else entirely, something new that she was building from the ground up, with her own 2 hands alongside his. She remembered what Mrs. Frost had told her. People will talk. Well, let them talk. They could think whatever they pleased. She knew what this arrangement was, and so did Silas. That was all that mattered. Still, knowing what it was and being able to prove it were 2 very different things. A handshake was a private promise, a hidden thing. No one else had seen it. No one else knew about it. And if something were to happen, if he got sick, or if he passed away, or if his family showed up to claim the ranch, she would be left with nothing. She would have no proof, no legal standing. She would just be another woman who had worked for a man that had shown her some kindness. She needed something more than just a handshake. She needed a legal document, something that could not be taken away from her, something that declared she belonged here, not just because he allowed it, but because it was hers by right. Sleep did not come easily that night. She tossed and turned, waking twice. The first time, it was the wind rattling the window pane. The second time, it was a noise she could not identify, maybe from a dream, or maybe it was nothing at all. Morning arrived. She woke before the sun, as she always did, built up the fire, and put the coffee on to brew. He came downstairs. They worked together in silence, following the same routine as always. But now, everything felt different. Everything had changed. After breakfast, he went into his office. She could hear drawers opening and closing, the rustle of papers, and the scratch of a pen. This went on for an hour, perhaps longer. Then he came out and walked into the kitchen where she was kneading bread with flour on her hands, the table, and her apron. He was holding some papers, official-looking documents on heavy, cream-colored paper. She could see dense black ink covering the pages. He placed them on the corner of the table, away from the flour. "I need your signature." She looked from the papers to him. His face was serious and calm, like a man who had made a decision and was absolutely sure of it. She wiped her hands on her apron, getting most of the flour off. She picked up the documents and read the title on the top page. It said, "Partnership Agreement, Iron Creek Ranch between Silas Carr and Sarah Hawthorne." She read it slowly and carefully. Every single word, every line. The language was legal, but it was clear enough. It stated an equal partnership in the operation of the ranch, an equal say in all decisions, and an equal share of the profits. If either one of them wanted to dissolve the partnership, the assets would be divided equally. If one of them passed away, the other would inherit their share. This was not a marriage certificate, nor was it an employment contract. It was a partnership, legal and binding. Her hands began to shake again. She put the papers down and pressed her palms flat against the table. A little puff of flour rose up and settled back down. "This is—" She could not finish her sentence. She did not have the words to describe what this was. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "We will need to file this at the courthouse to make it official, but I wanted you to read it over first. Make sure it says what you want it to say." She picked up the papers one more time and read them even slower. Every clause, every provision. Her name was right there, written in his own hand. "Sarah Hawthorne, partner." "When did you write this?" "Last night. After we talked. Last night, while she had been lying awake and worrying if a handshake was enough, he had been upstairs writing this. Making it real, making it permanent. Why?" He looked directly at her with that straightforward gaze of his, the one that seemed to see through everything and go right to the heart of the matter. "Because a handshake is a private matter. This is a public record. This says you own half of everything here, not because I am being kind and not because you are a hard worker. It is because you are my partner, a legal equal. If anything happens to me, this ranch is yours. It cannot be taken away from you. It cannot be questioned." Her throat felt tight. She swallowed hard, then swallowed again. The words on the page started to blur. She blinked, and they came back into focus. "I do not know what to say. Just say if it is right, if it is what you want." She read it one last time. The words had not changed. Partnership. Equal, legal, real. It is right. He stood up, went to his office, and came back with a pen, the kind with a steel nib and a bottle of ink. He set them down next to the papers. "Then sign it." She dipped the pen into the ink. The nib came out black. She tapped it against the rim of the bottle once, then twice, and then she signed her name. Her handwriting was smaller than his and neater. Each letter was formed with great care. Sarah Hawthorne, partner. The ink was still wet and shiny. She put the pen down. She did not blow on the ink, but just let it dry on its own. Silas signed his name below hers as a witness, and then he wrote the date. September 15th, 1882. It had been 3.5 months since she had met him at that crossroads. 3.5 months since the broken wheel, since she had climbed into his wagon with nothing but a carpet bag and 19 cents to her name. Now, she owned half of a ranch. He folded the papers and stood up. "I will take these into town on Monday and get them filed properly." She just nodded. She could not speak. If she tried to say anything, she felt that something inside her chest would break wide open, and she would never be able to put it back together. He left, heading back outside. She heard the door close behind him. She just stood there with flour on the table and the bread dough waiting, her hands shaking so hard that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. Partnership, legal, real, and it was hers. She looked down at her hands. They were still dirty, still scarred, and still marked by hard labor. But now, They were the hands of a woman who owned something, of a woman who belonged somewhere, of a woman who had built something that was going to last. She went back to kneading the bread. The dough felt soft and elastic. She pushed it, folded it, and pushed it again. The steady rhythm calmed her down. The familiar motion, the smell of yeast and flour, and the warmth coming from the stove were all comforting. By the time the bread was rising, she had stopped shaking. In the afternoon, she was back working in her garden. The basil was ready to be harvested. She cut the tops off and left the stems. They would grow back. That was the way basil worked. You cut it, and it just grew back stronger. She heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked up. Silas was riding back from the south pasture. He saw her and gave a nod. She nodded back. It was the same as every other day, the same routine, but now everything was different. That evening, after the dishes were done, they sat on the porch. He smoked his pipe and she mended a shirt. The crickets began their nightly song. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, then purple, then black. He was the first to speak. "Do you want to take a walk tomorrow? The creek is running good after last week's rain." Yes, it was that simple, that easy. Just partners, making plans. The stars came out thick and bright against the dark sky. She could see the Milky Way stretched out like a splash of spilled milk. She finished her mending, folded the shirt, and placed it in her basket. "I should get some sleep." "Me too." They went inside. He locked the front door while she carried the lamp. At the bottom of the stairs, they went their separate ways. He went up, and she went into her room. She closed the door and set the lamp on the washstand. She looked around the room at the furniture, the quilt on the bed, the rug on the floor, and the apron hanging on the wall. All of it was hers now. Not borrowed, not given to her, but truly hers. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. Her feet were clean tonight. She had washed them before dinner, scrubbing all the dirt out from under her nails. They still smelled faintly of sage, a scent that never quite washed off but just seemed to live in your skin. She lay down and pulled the quilt up over her. It was a wedding ring pattern, hundreds of them, in blue and cream with perfect stitching. She pressed her palm against the design, feeling the fabric, the work, and the care that had gone into it. Tomorrow they would walk down to the creek and make plans for the spring planting. They would talk about expanding the garden and building a chicken coop big enough for more hens. It was all the small things that added up to a life, a real life, and it was a life she was building with her own two hands. She closed her eyes. Her father's watch ticked in a steady, reliable rhythm, the same rhythm it had kept for 20 years. "Iron does not perform," he used to say. It just is. She was finally learning that. Learning to just be, without pretending, without performing, just existing as herself. Sarah Hawthorne, partner, owner, a woman who fixed what was broken and built things that would last. Sleep came easily that night, deep and without dreams. When she woke up, it would be to the smell of coffee already brewing, and bread already rising, and a full day of work waiting for her. The same as always, the same rhythm, the same partnership. But now, when people in town whispered, when Mrs. Frost smiled that cold smile of hers, when anyone questioned if Sarah belonged here, there would be papers at the courthouse that said otherwise. Legal, binding, and permanent. She belonged here because she had earned it, because she had helped build it, and because it was hers. 3 weeks passed. The partnership papers sat filed away at the courthouse, legally recorded. Sarah's name was in the county records right next to Silas's. Equal owners of the Iron Creek Ranch. They had gone into town on a Monday, just like he said they would, walked right into the courthouse together and filed the papers. The clerk had looked at them, over his reading glasses, read the whole document, glanced at Sarah, then over at Silas, and brought his stamp down without a word. He filed it away in the huge leather-bound book that held all the property records. As they walked out, they saw Mrs. Frost on the wooden sidewalk. She caught their eye, started to smile, But then she froze. Something about the way they walked together, shoulder to shoulder, neither one in front of the other, gave her pause. She just gave a short nod and carried on her way. No questions asked, no comments made. The news got around, not like a wildfire, but slow and steady, the way news does in a small town. By Thursday, the owner of the general store had asked for Sarah's thoughts on what to order for the winter. By Saturday, the town banker tipped his hat to her right on the main street. After 2 weeks, nobody even batted an eye. Sarah Hawthorne was a partner, a landowner, a woman who could fix a broken wagon wheel and build a whole life from nothing but dirt, hard work, and one good man's choice to see her for who she truly was. Now it was October. The terrible heat had finally broken. The mornings had a cool bite to them. The prairie grass was no longer green, but a sea of gold. The garden was almost all put away. Tomatoes were canned. Herbs were dried and hanging from the kitchen rafters. Basil and sage and thyme. Their smell was the smell of the house. Sarah was up before the sun. Same as she always was, but it was easier now. The mattress no longer made her back ache. The room did not feel so empty. Her dresses hung in the wardrobe. She had 3 of them now, a brown one, a gray one, and a brand new blue one she had sewn from fabric Silas brought back from town. Her father's old leather apron was still hanging crooked on a nail by the door. Just yesterday, she had looked at it, touched the cracked leather and the old burn marks, and just left it be. Some things are not meant to be fixed. She went on downstairs and built up the fire. The stove caught right away. She had learned just the right amount of kindling it liked, and how to place the log so the air would pull through just right. The coffee was already boiling by the time she heard the floorboards groan upstairs. He came down, poured a cup for himself, and stood near the stove's warmth. She cracked eggs into the hot skillet. He sliced the bread. Their hands moved around each other, a well-practiced dance, not a single wasted motion. They ate their breakfast. He read the newspaper from yesterday. She just looked out the window. The sun was barely starting to show. A line of orange light stretched across the horizon. The prairie seemed to go on forever. This was home. He set the paper down, folding it neatly. What needs fixing? She had been mulling this over. The porch rail is still a little loose. I've been meaning to mention it. I will get to it today. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. What else? Else? What would you change? This house is yours, too. What would you want to be different? She took a look around the kitchen. The windows were bare, the walls were plain. Everything was useful and clean, but it was stark. Curtains, maybe, for the front room. He nodded his head. What kind? Something simple. Nothing too fancy. Just something to block the afternoon sun. Do you want to pick them out, or should I order some from the catalog? I can pick them. The next time we ride into town, we will go on Friday. It was always we now, never I. After breakfast, he went out to fix the porch rail. She could hear the hammering, the sound of wood being replaced with new, solid boards, the kind that would not rot for many years. She washed the dishes, took a look in the pantry, and started a list of what they would need for the winter. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, beans, and cornmeal. The list kept growing. She would show it to Silas later on. They would place the order together, make the decisions together. Partners. About mid-morning, he came back inside. Want to go for a walk? She looked up from working the bread dough. Where to? Down by the creek. The water is running real good. We have not been down there for a while. She covered the dough with a cloth and wiped her hands on her apron. Yes. They walked out of the house together, past the barn, where the 3 ranch hands were cleaning out the stalls, and past the corral where the horses were standing and dozing in the warm sun. They crossed the yard and went through the north pasture. The grass there was tall, its seed heads heavy. The stalks brushed against Sarah's skirt, leaving little bits of chaff stuck to the fabric. The ground was uneven. There were prairie dog holes and gopher mounds everywhere. She had to watch her step. The sun was warm on her skin, but not hot. The air smelled of dried grass and dust and the wide open space. A hawk was circling way up overhead, catching the high currents. Its shadow flickered over them and was gone in a heartbeat. The creek finally came into view. Iron Creek, about 20 feet across. The water was shallow, clear and cold, and it ran over smooth stones. On the east bank, there were willow trees, young ones, maybe 10 years old. Their leaves were just starting to change from green to a golden yellow. They sat down on the bank. The grass was soft, having been pressed down flat by cattle that came to drink. The water made a quiet burbling sound, a constant murmur. It was the same sound it had made for years, and would make for many more to come. Sarah picked up a stone. It was gray and smooth, worn round by the current. She turned it over and over in her hand. Why do they call it Iron Creek? Silas leaned back on his hands and looked at the water. Found iron ore deposits when I bought the land. A whole vein of it runs right under us, goes way down deep. He scooped up a stone of his own and tossed it into the creek. It landed with a soft plunk. The ripples widened out and then disappeared. A fella came out from Denver, tested the ground, and said there was iron down there for sure. Good iron, he said, but not enough to make a real profit. It would cost a man more to dig it up than it was ever worth. He wiped his hands on his trousers. Most folks would have been let down by that news. Me, I was relieved. Why? Because it meant the iron could just stay put. We did not have to use it. We did not have to tear up the earth for it. Just knowing it was resting under the ground was enough for me. He looked at her then, talking about a kind of value that exists without being taken. She understood completely, thinking of her father's iron stock. All those bars and rods and sheets he never once used. He just kept them, just in case. The having it was enough. The knowing it was there, its presence. What are you fixing to plant this spring? She had been thinking about more of everything. Beans and squash and tomatoes. Maybe some corn if we can keep the crows out of it. More herbs, the medicinal kind too. Things like feverfew and chamomile, stuff we can actually use. You want a bigger garden plot? Yes. About twice the size of what I have now. I will have the men turn over the soil for you in March, get it all ready. They just sat. The creek water kept on flowing. The sun kept on climbing the sky. The shadows got shorter and then began to stretch out long again. You ever get to thinking about leaving? He finally asked. The question did not catch her off guard. She had pondered it herself sometimes late in the night. When the wind howled something fierce, when the old house groaned, when the loneliness of the place pressed in on her. No. Do you? No. He picked up another smooth stone. He did not throw this one, he just held it in his palm. But you could, you know. The papers we signed are legal. You own a full half. You could sell your share, take the money and go anywhere you pleased. I know. I just want you to know that you can. She looked straight at him. His face was dead serious, honest. He truly meant it. He was not testing her. He was not making a threat. He was just stating a fact. I do not want to. He nodded his head and set the stone back down. Good. They sat there for a good long while. The comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that settles in when two people just understand each other. When you do not need words. When just being there is enough. A coyote yipped somewhere off to the west. Another one answered back. The sound carried clear across the open country. It was wild and lonesome and beautiful. Sarah stood up, brushing blades of grass from her skirt. Silas stood up too. They walked back together through the tall grass, going past the corrals, past the big barn, and into the main yard. The house looked stark white in the afternoon sun, though the paint was still peeling off at the corners. She had brought up repainting it. He had said, next summer. They would do it together. They would pick out the color together. Probably white again, he figured. But it would be their choice, their decision. They paused at the bottom of the porch steps. The new handrail shined, fresh-cut light wood, solid and strong. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking me about what needs fixin'. It is your house, too. It should be the way you want it. Not just the house, but the ranch, the life, all of it. Hers and theirs, built together from busted wheels and prairie dirt and honest-to-goodness work." She climbed up the steps. He followed right behind her. They went on inside. The whole house smelled of fresh bread. The dough had risen high. She shaped it into loaves and set them in the oven to bake. The warmth from the oven filled the kitchen. It felt good. He sat down at the table, opened the ledger book, and started making entries. She worked right there beside him, peeling potatoes for their dinner. It was that companionable silence they had built, piece by piece, one day at a time, week after week. That evening they ate their meal at the table, bread straight from the oven, with butter, and the very last of the tomatoes from the garden. It was simple food, but it was good food. They talked about the cattle, which ones they ought to sell and which ones to keep for breeding. They talked about the fence line that needed checking, and about ordering supplies before the first snow flew. Small plans, real plans, the kind of plans a person can actually keep. After the dishes were done, they sat out on the porch. The new rail felt smooth beneath her hand. He smoked his pipe. She did some mending. The crickets sang their loud, insistent autumn song, different from their summer chirping, more urgent, like they knew their time was running short. The stars started popping out, thick and bright. She felt like she could see everything. The Big Dipper, the belt of Orion rising up, and the Milky Way looking like a great river of light spilled across the blackness. "Are you happy here?" he asked. She kept on stitching, the needle catching the starlight, flashing like silver. In and out, making a torn thing whole again. Yes, it was just one word, but it held everything inside it. The crossroads, the broken wheel, the empty room, the furniture, the quilt, the ledger that had her name in it, the partnership papers, the garden, the creek, the iron that lay sleeping underneath. All of it. Me too. They sat there. The night got deeper and a little colder. She finished her mending, folded the shirt, and set it in her basket. "I should get some sleep. Me too." They went back inside. He locked the front door. She carried the lamp. When they got to the stairs, they went their separate ways. He went on up. She went into her own room. She closed her door and set the lamp down on the washstand. Her father's old watch sat right beside the porcelain pitcher, ticking away, steady as can be. She wound it 13 turns, the same as she always did. She glanced around the room, seeing everything in its proper place, everything that was hers. The bed, the wardrobe, the rug, even the apron hanging a little crooked on the wall. She walked over to the apron, touching the leather. It was cracked and burned and real. The faint smell of smoke and iron and hard work still clung to the grain. "I did it, Papa," she whispered to the quiet room. "I built something that is gonna hold." She sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. The quilt felt smooth under her hands. A pattern of wedding rings, hundreds of them, in blue and cream with perfect little stitches. She laid down and pulled the quilt up over her. The fabric was soft from so many washings, worn down in all the right places. It was loved and used and real. She closed her eyes and just listened. The house settling for the night, the wind sighing outside, the sound of Silas moving around upstairs, his door closing softly, her father's watch ticking away. All familiar sounds, the sounds of home. Tomorrow she would wake up before the dawn, build the fire, and start the coffee. He would come on down, and they would work alongside each other. The same routine, the same partnership, building something one day at a time, something that was meant to last. She thought back to the crossroads. It was just 4 months ago, but it felt like a whole lifetime ago. 3 roads splitting off and her just sitting there with absolutely nothing. No direction, no hope, just dust and heat and a whole lot of emptiness. She had chosen the road that went east, or maybe it had chosen her. Either way, here she was now. Not because she had nowhere else to turn, but because this was the place where she truly belonged. Partnership, ownership, Home. Iron does not perform. Her father used to say that all the time. It just is. She had finally learned what that meant, how to just be, without putting on a show, without pretending, just existing as herself. Sarah Hawthorne, partner, owner, a woman who fixed broken things and built new things that lasted. Sleep came to her easy. Came to a deep kind of sleep, the kind that only comes when you know right down to your bones where you belong, when you know you have earned it, when you know it is yours. The very last thing she heard was her father's watch, ticking, steady and reliable, marking the time, and building the hours into days, the days into weeks, and the weeks into a life. A life she had built with her own two hands, with dirt and with work, and with one man's willingness to see her for who she was, to stand right beside her, to build something together that was strong enough to hold. You know, there is a certain quiet that settles in your heart when a story like this one comes to its close. It is not exactly relief, and it is not quite satisfaction. It is just that familiar feeling of knowing that some things can't be mended with promises. They can only be fixed with time and with hard work done side by side. I reckon a lot of us have stood at our own crossroads. Maybe not with 3 dusty roads and a wedding ring lying in the dirt, but with that same hollow feeling of not knowing which way you are supposed to turn. And maybe some of us learn, just like Sarah did, that the best kinds of partnerships are not built on somebody rescuing somebody else or on grand romance. They are built on competence and respect, on 2 people who see each other plain as day and make the choice to stay anyway. We do not always get the big dramatic ending. Sometimes it is just coffee at dawn and hands that know exactly where things go. Sometimes it is a partnership paper filed down at the courthouse and a garden plot that needs turning come the spring. Small things, real things, the kind of things that hold. It is all right if this story does not tie up in a neat little bow. Life hardly ever does. Sarah has still got dirt under her fingernails. The paint on the house is still peeling at the corners, but she owns half of a ranch now, and that is enough. That is more than enough. I want to thank y'all for sitting a spell with Sarah and Silas these past few weeks, for staying with them through the quiet parts, for listening all the way to the end.